The sun was high in the sky and the twin moons were glowing behind the clouds as the crowd screamed in the royal arena of Eltraxi. People of the Empire were waiting for blood and victory, and their champion stood tall in the center of the arena. He was 9 feet tall with silver skin and burning red eyes, and his armor was made of bones from past enemies. He raised his blade and roared like a beast, and the people answered with loud cheers. On a high golden throne sat Princess Salira, the daughter of Emperor Tharian, and the pride of the Empire. She wore royal armor with sharp edges, and her face was calm but proud. Her royal maids stood beside her in silence, their eyes on the arena. She had seen many fights, and she never feared defeat, because no one had ever beaten their champion. But today something was different. A new slave had arrived from the outer colonies, a strange creature called a human. He was small with soft skin and strange eyes, and his body had no armor, no weapons, just simple rags and chains. The guards brought him forward and threw him into the arena. The crowd laughed and shouted insults, and the princess looked bored. "This human is nothing," she said to her chief maid. "He will die in seconds." The champion stepped forward and raised his great axe, and the sun made the blade shine like fire. The human did not move. He only looked around slowly and then looked up at the throne. His eyes met the princess, and for a moment something cold ran through her body. She felt like he was not afraid at all. "Begin the match," shouted the arena master, and the gates closed behind them. The champion ran forward like a mountain falling, and the human stood still. Then something happened. The human moved to the side so fast no one saw. I jumped and spun, and in one motion grabbed the chain from his wrist and swung it around the champion's legs. The giant stumbled, and before he could recover, the human was already behind him. The human picked up a fallen blade from an old fighter on the ground and turned with one smooth motion. He cut across the back of the champion's legs and brought the beast to his knees. The crowd went silent. The champion roared in pain and tried to stand, but the human climbed up his back with speed and balance like a shadow. He raised the blade and with one hard strike split the champion down the middle from shoulder to waist. The crowd screamed in shock. The champion fell into the dust with a crash, and his blood spread like red fire across the golden sand. The human stood over him, breathing slow, his body covered in blood, not his own. Up in the throne, the princess stood up, her eyes wide, her heart racing. "This cannot be," she whispered. The arena master dropped his staff in disbelief, and the guards looked at each other, unsure what to do. Then the silence broke with a slow sound of metal chains dropping to the ground. The human looked up again, his eyes locked on the princess, and this time there was no fear, only something calm and dangerous. "Law must be followed," said the old high priest who had watched the fight from the royal box. "By the law of victory, the winner may claim the rewards offered to the loser." The arena offered the champion the princess and her maids as a symbol of strength and beauty. It was a tradition made to honor power and blood. Now the human was the victor, and the law was clear. Princess Azalira felt her pride burn like fire, but she could not speak against the law in front of her people. To break the law meant weakness and shame. She looked down at the human, who now stood still like a statue, waiting for the next move. "This is not possible," she said again, but her voice was weak. Her father would not allow this. She thought he would change the law, he would save her honor, but her father did not stand. He did not speak. The emperor was not in the arena today, and the law could not wait. The people were still silent, unsure, afraid, and amazed. Some of them began to whisper. Some began to bow. "The champion is dead, and the human is the new champion," they said. "He must be respected. He must be obeyed." The human turned and began to walk toward the gate, but the guards blocked his path. He stopped and raised one hand. "He claimed nothing," he said in a clear, strong voice. "I did not come to take. I came to survive, but the law is not broken by words, and the law must be fulfilled." "Take him to the royal chambers," said the priest. "The law now binds him to the royal house." The princess looked at her maids, and they looked back at her with fear. None of them knew what would come next. None of them understood what the human really was or what he truly wanted, but one thing was clear. The arena of glory had a new ruler, and his name was not known, not yet, but soon the whole empire would speak it, not with laughter but with fear, respect, and curiosity, because today the human had done the impossible. He had split the champion in half. Bent. Now the princess belonged to him by law. The palace was silent that night, as if the walls were holding their breath, and the stars above the empire watched from behind dark clouds with cold silver light. Princess Zelira stood by the tall window in her royal chamber, her hands clenched tightly behind her back and her jaw stiff with unspoken rage. She had never known defeat, not in battle, not in law, not in life, but now the rule she was born to protect had turned against her. Behind her the royal maids moved slowly, placing candles and incense around the room, their eyes down, their hearts full of questions they could not ask. The law of victory was clear and written in the blood of thousands who had fallen before, and it was made by her ancestors to honor the strongest above all. No one had ever expected a human slave to become that strongest one. The human, now called champion by the arena, had been taken to the lower royal chambers, not as a prisoner but as a guest of the throne. The throne that once ruled over him. Zelira could not sleep. She had not removed her armor, and her golden crown sat heavy on her head. The silence was broken when the old high priest entered the room with slow steps and tired eyes. His white robes moved like mist, and his voice was gentle but sharp. "You must accept it, princess," he said, "not because you are weak, but because the law does not care about pride." The people saw what he did. They saw it with open eyes, and their hearts cannot unsee it. Or break the law now would mean to break the throne itself. Salira turned toward him, her eyes burning like blue fire. He is a slave from a lost world. He is not one of you, is not a warrior of the blood. The priest nodded on. Yet he broke your champion in two with nothing but speed and instinct. There was no trick, no poison, no armor, just skill and truth. The maids looked at each other, their faces pale. They had seen the human tooth, they had seen his eyes in the arena and how calm they were even after the kill. He had not smiled, he had not roared, he had only stood in silence like he was waiting for something greater. The law says that champion may claim the offerings, Salira said, her voice low, but he claimed nothing. He only stood there. He looked at me not like a prize, not like a prize, not like a queen, not like a thing. He looked at me like I was a question. The priest placed his hand on his heart. And the law binds more than just bodies. Sometimes it binds fate, and fate has chosen him. Before she could answer, the guard captain knocked once and entered with a small bow. Princess, the human wishes to speak with you in private. He asks for no weapons, no chains, and no god. Salira's eyes narrowed and she nodded slowly. Well, she said, I will hear the one who defeated Veltrax, but I will hear him as a ruler, not a gift. Moments later she entered the chamber prepared for him. It was simple and old, with no decorations, no silk, no gold. The human sat on the floor, legs crossed, hands open, head raised. He did not stand, he did not kneel, he only watched her come in with steady eyes. You asked for this meeting, she said, her voice cold. Speak your reason. Before I forget, Mercy. The human took a breath and began to speak in perfect imperial tongue. Your empire took my brothers and sisters. Your hunters came to our outposts and took us like beasts. I was not a warrior, I was a scout. I came to watch and report, but your slavers caught me before I could return. I did not come to conquer, but to survive, and now I stand here with your law wrapped around me like a chain. Salira was silent. She had never heard a slave speak like this. She had never seen eyes that held pain without fear. What do you want? She asked. The law says you own me now, and the maids as well. Will you claim your prize or speak riddles until the moons fall? The human stood now, and his voice was softer. I want you to see not me, not this chamber, not this law, but the storm that is coming. My people will not wait forever. They will come, and they will not ask for peace. They will ask for what was taken, and they will burn what stands in their way, unless someone shows them that your empire can change, unless someone powerful enough dares to break traditionless. You, Doc. Salira felt her heart shift, not from fear, but from something older, something like truth. She had always ruled with power and pride, but now a new kind of power stood before her, one that came not from war, but from survival, from pain, from warning. She turned and walked toward the door. She paused once and looked back at him. You are no slave, she said, but you are still bound, and so am I. Law stands until I find a way to stand above it. The human gave a small nod. Then let us both stand. And the storm outside the palace grew stronger, as if the sky itself had heard the man, waited for what would come next. The stars above the empire moved slowly like ancient watches blinking with cold fire as Princess Salira sat alone in her private chamber, dressed not in gold but in simple robes, with her crown resting beside her on the marble table. Her thoughts were not still, and her mind played the human's words again and again like an old song. Trapped in a quiet room, he had not asked for power, he had not asked for mercy, he had only given a warning and left the weight of choice in her hands. Outside her window, the banners of the empire waved in silence, their colors bold but somehow duller than before. The maids moved carefully around her room, placing scrolls and tea and keeping their voices low as if something invisible filled the air. In the lower hall, the human sat with the high priest and two guards, both unarmed, both unsure why they were there at all. The priest asked him about his world, and the human spoke of blue skies and deep oceans, of cities under domes and ships that danced between stars. He spoke of the war that began when alien ships attacked human colonies with no warning and no reason, and how Earth responded with silence and shadows first, then with fire and steel. Later he explained how the first human fleet vanished near the edge of alien space, and how Earth did not forget that loss. He said more ships would come, not for rescue but for justice, and Earth's justice was not slow and not soft. The high priest listened with eyes wide and heart cold, for he had heard the same stars speak in his dreams, and now they whispered louder back in her chamber. Princess Salira called for her chief maid, a quiet woman named Vera, who had served her since childhood and trusted her more than blood. Tell me what you saw in him, she said, not as a ruler but as a woman. Vera hesitated, then spoke with care. He kills like a soldier, but he walks like a teacher, and when he looks at people he sees more than faces. He sees pain, and he does not enjoy it. Does not look at us like Princess, he looks at us like perplex. Salira stood and walked to the mirror where her reflection waited without judgment. She removed her crown and stared at her own eyes and saw something she did not expect. She saw doubt, she saw curiosity, she saw fear, not of the human but of what he meant for the world. She thought she understood. Later that night, under the shadow of the moons, she went to the lower hall again. Alone, without guards, without maids, only with questions wrapped in silence. The human stood when she entered, not in respect but in habit, and waited for her words. Why tell me all this? She asked. Why give warning to the one who owns youth? Human did not smile and did not move. Because you do not own me and I do not own you, but we both own choice is if your people prepare for war, Earth will respond with fire and your cities will become stories told in ashes. But if someone powerful stands between the blades, perhaps the blades will pause. Excelera walked closer and looked at him, not as a slave, not as a champion, not as a man, but as a mirror to a future not yet. Made you ask me to betray my empire, she said. He shook his head. I ask you to save it from itself, from pride, from old laws that chain your hands while your enemies sharpen knives. Princess took a long breath and closed her eyes. She remembered the arena, the blood, the silence, the way he stood not in triumph but in warning. She remembered the way the crowd changed, not because of fear but because of wonder. They had seen something new, and they could not forget. Ichi opened her eyes. If I help you, she said, what will you do? The human looked toward the window as if he could see the stars beyond. I will call for my people and ask them to wait, not forever but long enough to listen. If you speak they might hear, but if you fight them they will not speak it. Alzalira nodded once, slow and heavy. Then you must send your message, and I will make sure it leaves this palace without being stopped. The human bowed his head and pressed his hand to his chest, not in victory, not in thanks, but in unity. Later, that same night, a hidden signal left the palace, under layers of code and silence, and crossed the stars to reach a waiting ship just beyond the edge of known space. The message was short. I am alive. I have won the arena. I have found one who might listen. Wait for my word before fire. Inside the empire something had changed, not loudly, not with banners, but with a whisper, the kind that grows over time and becomes a voice that cannot be ignored. Zalira looked out at the stars and saw them not as cold watchers but as roads leading to choices, and far beyond them Earth waited, not as a victim but as a storm. And now the question was no longer if it would arrive, the question was what would greet it when it did. The palace lights burned low and the halls whispered with the steps of silent feet as shadows moved where no guards watched and cold eyes followed the doors of the human's chamber from corners wrapped in gold and fear. Malric stood in the war room far from the royal tower, his arms crossed and his voice quiet like a blade resting before the cut. He had seen what happened in the arena, and he had watched the princess bow to the law, but he did not believe in law made weak by strangers. The empire must not kneel to something it cannot understand, he said to the group of loyal captains around him. He is not a warrior, he is a weapon, and weapons are not kept in palaces. The others nodded, though some looked unsure, because the human had not asked for power and had not demanded gold, and had not hurt anyone after the fight. But fear does not wait for proof, and the general did not wait for permission. He sent his men through the back tunnels dressed in royal guard robes with orders that needed no explanation. The human must fall before the people begin to rise. At the same moment, Princess Zalira sat beside her private map of the stars, marking paths with her finger as if she could touch the places where danger waited. She had sent the message to Earth, and she had broken a rule so old it had no name anymore, and now she waited not for reply but for change. Her maid Vera entered with fast steps and eyes wide and breath caught in her chest. They are coming, she said. They wear the armor of your god, but I know their faces. They follow Mal Rexthi, mean to kill the human tonight. Zalira stood without a word and reached for the blade hidden behind her curtain, not the sword of a princess but the knife of a soldier. She moved through the back stairs with Vera at her side, and they passed no guards and heard no voices, just the cold wind moving through stone like a warning. Without sound, the human was seated on the floor as he often did, with his back to the wall and his eyes closed as if sleep could protect him. When the first man entered with his blade high, the human rolled to the side and kicked the weapon from his hand. The second came with a spear, and the human blocked with the chain from his wrist, spinning it fast and striking with the weight like iron wind. The third moved with speed but not enough, and the human caught his arm, twisted and dropped him like broken wood. But there were 5 more. The door broke open with force and the attackers came in a wave, and the human backed against the wall, ready but outnumbered. That was when Zalira entered with fire in her eyes and steel in her hand. She moved with purpose and struck with skill, and her knife found armor and flesh with no hesitation. Vera followed, using a tray as shield and a candle holder as weapon, and her cry was louder than steel and sharper than Lotha. Room became a storm of motion and breath and blood, and then it was over. Only silence remained as Lyra stood over the last attacker, her knife dripping and her face calm but her heart beating like war drum. She turned to the human and looked at him as if seeing him for the first time again. He was hurt but not broken. He was tired but not afraid. You were right, she said. The danger is not just outside, it is here. The human nodded and touched his side where blood ran slow and dark. Then we must not wait for the storm to find us. We must move first before morning broke. The general was summoned by force and brought before the throne with iron on his hands and shame on his face. The people were not told everything, but they saw enough. They saw the princess walk beside the human and not behind. They saw the champion speak in the court with respect and with warning. They saw change not written in words but in actions in the quiet corners of the palace. The other maids whispered stories not of fear but of hope. They had watched the human fight, not to win but to live. They had seen their princess bleed not for pride but for truth, and they began to believe in something more than law, in something more than blood, and something that felt like future. The high priest blessed the sky that night, and his voice trembled, for he too had dreamed of flames and stars, and now Those dreams felt close and real. The message from Earth came not in words but in light, say, signal above the moons, seen only by those who watched with the right eyes. It said, we have heard. It said, we wait in the heart of the empire where the law once ruled without question. A new path opened, not wide, not safe, but real, and the human walked it with wounds on his body and allies at his side, and the princess walked it to no longer alone, no longer certain but no longer afraid, because enemies within may break walls but truth from beyond can build something stronger. The sky turned red as the twin moons faded behind thick clouds, and a strange wind moved through the city of towers, where people looked up with wide eyes and tight hearts. The stars above the empire no longer whispered, they shouted with light, and every shipmaster on every roof saw the same thing, blinking in patterns too perfect to be natural. Princess Zelira stood on the balcony of the high tower, her hair dancing in the wind, her cloak pressed against her back and her eyes fixed on the sky, as if it had spoken her name beside her. The human said nothing, his hands rested on the stone rail, his breath slow and his face calm, but inside his mind ran fast like 1,000 machines working in the dark. The signal is clear, he said. They know I live and they know I sent the message. Zelira nodded, her voice quiet but steady. Then they will come. The human looked at her not as ruler or ally but as the only bridge between two storms. They will come not to ask but to act. The high priest arrived with scrolls in his hands and fear on his face. He spoke of omens in the flame and visions in the dust, and how the stars no longer moved as they should. The law cannot help us now, he said. The law was built for peace through power, not for fire from the skying. The war chambers, the old captains argued with younger ones, some still loyal to the general, now held in chains, others unsure where loyalty should live when the stars begin to fall. Zelira entered without guards and stood at the center, with the human at her side, and she raised one hand not to silence them but to offer them something new. We are not ready for what is coming, she said, and we cannot fight what we do not understand. They do not want our land or gold or names. They want their people returned, and their pain answered. The human stepped forward, and his voice was like iron wrapped in silk. You took us like cargo. You sold us like tools. You broke our names, and now you wonder why the sky is angry. But I do not come with vengeance, I come with warning. You still have a choice. The captains looked at each other and saw not weakness in him, but something worse and something stronger. They saw truth outside the walls. The people gathered in the square, their voices low, their hands held close, and their eyes lifted to the sky where a new star had appeared, not burning, not falling, but waiting. The star did not move. It hovered beyond the moons, bright and silent and endless. It watched in the palace tower. The signal room blinked red for the first time in 100 years, and the message was short and cold and final. This is Earth Fleet Omega. We receive your signal. We see your beacon. We demand safe extraction of our citizen. You have one cycle to comply. Failure will be answered. Message repeated in every language known to the empire. Then it stopped. The air grew heavy as if the world itself was holding breath. Zelira turned to the council, and her voice did not shake. We'll grant the demand, and we will return all human captives held in any corner of this empire, and we will ask for talks, not as rulers but as survivors. Some shouted betrayal, others shouted wisdom, but none dared move against her because the people were watching and the stars were waiting. The maids walked through the halls gathering names of slaves and where they were held and how they were taken, and each name was like a wound opened again, but now seen and not hidden. The human helped them send new signals coded and clear with names and locations and timelines, and Earth replied with silence, not of doubt but of patience. The fleet moved closer, now visible with eyes alone, no glass, no machine needed. The ships were dark silver and shaped like wings, and they did not glow with flame but with quiet power. The empire had never seen such ships. They were not for show. They were not for show. They were for purpose. In the great square the people gathered again, this time not in protest, not in anger but in wonder. Children pointed, elders prayed, and no one spoke of law. They spoke of change. When the first ship descended, it did not land with thunder. It touched the ground like a whisper and opened like a flower of metal. Soldiers stepped out with calm eyes and ready hands, but no raised weapons. They formed a path, and at the end of that path stood a woman in armor unlike any seen in the empire, her face hard, her voice clear. I am Admiral Lorne of Earth, she said, and I am here for my people. Zelira stepped forward and bowed, not low, not weak, but with respect. You will have them, and you will have more than names. You will have a voice in our halls, and we will listen, not because we must, but because we choose to. The human stood between them and said nothing, because nothing more was needed. The choice had been made, and far above them in the sky where stars once burned alone, the light of Earth now stood beside them, not as enemy, not as master, but as answer. Night fell over the empire with skies wrapped in silver and wind that whispered like old stories, and in the heart of the royal city the people stood still, not from fear but from something older and quieter called. All the ships of Earth did not fire and the soldiers did not shout, but every step they took changed the weight of the world, and every breath they drew made history. Bending the royal hall, Princess Zelira stood before the great stone table where war had once been planned and now peace waited like a candle. Not yet. Neither hand rested on the hilt of her blade, not in threat but in memory, and beside her stood the human who had once been a slave and now was something else. He wore no crown, no armor, no medals, only the scars that spoke of fire and chains and survival. The captains came forward one by one, their heads low, their eyes open, and they placed their blades on the table without a word. They had seen what the stars brought, and they had felt what silence meant, and they knew the old ways could not hold this new world. The high priest spoke of prophecy, and signs and dreams filled with fire and steel and strange voices that came from the edge of time, and now he said those voices had names, and those names had ships. Alera looked at the people gathered not as a ruler speaking to subjects, but as a woman speaking to those who must walk beside her or not. At all we have feared what we did not know, she said, and we have broken what we could not name, but now the truth stands among us, and we must choose if we meet it with open hands or closed fists. The people listened, and the halls were quiet, and no one shouted because the old words no longer fit outside the walls. A different kind of storm was building in the hidden corners of the city. Those loyal to the fallen general whispered in shadows, and passed blades between hands, and spoke of pride, lost and glory stolen. They said the empire had bowed and must rise again. One of them moved with purpose, a man named Krell, who had once trained the royal guard and knew the back halls like his own breath. He carried a blade dipped in poison and a heart filled with fire, and he moved through the palace with silence as his friend. He passed guards with a nod and servants with a smile, and reached the upper chambers where the princess would rest. But tonight she was not alone. The human stood near the window watching the stars and thinking of Earth and how close it now felt and how far it still was. He heard the breath before the step, and he turned as the blade came forward. It moved fast and sharp, but not faster than memory. The human caught the wrist, twisted the arm, and brought the attacker to the floor without sound. The blade fell, and Rola Jalira rushed from the next room, her eyes wide and her voice cold. Another one, she said. Another ghost of the old ways guards arrived and took the man in chains, and his eyes burned with hatred, not for the human, but for change. Later that night the princess sat beside the human in the garden, where flowers glowed with soft blue light, and silence felt safe again. Why do you keep standing between me and danger? She asked, not with anger but with weight. Because danger finds you, and I am not good at running away, he said. With a small breath. You could leave now, she said. Earth is here, and the law cannot stop you anymore. He looked at her and saw not a crown or a throne, but a person made from fire and stone. And chose, I will leave when I am no longer needed. And not a moment before he said, she nodded and looked at the stars with him, not as ruler and guest but as equals. The next day the court gathered, and the maids stood in robes of silver, and the banners were lowered, then raised again with new colors stitched beside the old A symbol of Earth, joined the crest of the empire, not above, not below, but beside. The human walked into the chamber, not with chains, not with guards, but with honor. The priest spoke first, and his words echoed in every hall. He stood when others fell, he has saved. When others struck, he has warned. When others lied, he is champion, not by blade but by burden. He shall be called protector, not of blood but of bond. The people bowed, and the human did not speak, because some moments are too full for words. Then the quiet that followed. Zalira stepped forward and placed a new chain around his neck, not of metal but of woven light. This binds nothing, she said. This reminds everything. The maids came to him not as gifts, not as servants, but as friends, and their hands touched his in thanks and trust. And far above the ships of Earth watched and waited and wondered what this new path would bring. And deep inside the empire a wound began to close, not fast, not easy, but real, because the human who had once been a slave now stood not alone, not afraid, not silent, but seen. The sun rose slow over the capital, and light fell across the towers like golden rivers, and the people of the empire stepped from their homes, not to kneel, not to shout, but to see what the new day would bring. The old banners had been taken down and folded with care, and now fresh cloth hung from every wall, painted with two crests joined by stars and held by open hands. In the royal court Princess Zelira sat upon a seat no longer called a throne, and around her stood elders and scholars and soldiers and builders and healers, and no voice spoke higher than another, and no name carried more weight than truth. Human stood beside her wearing robes of soft gray stitched with silver, and his face held calm, but his eyes watched every corner like a guardian made of memory and purpose. Today was not for speeches and not for speeches and not for crowns, but for something more rare and more difficult. Today was for change that lasts beyond the hour and breathes longer than fear. Salira stood and spoke, not to rule but to share the law that once ruled us. With steel is broken, not by fire, not by force, but by choice, and in its place we build not a throne but a circle. No more slaves, no more chains, no more victories that cost us our souls. From this day forward no voice shall be silent, and no pain shall be unseen. Let this be the first day of the last empire. The people did not cheer, they placed hands to hearts and heads to sky, and their silence was not empty, it was full. In the space where the champion once stood, now stood children carrying scrolls of new words written by many hands and touched by no blood. The maids who once stood in silence now spoke with clarity and strength, and their stories became laws, not because they were loud but because they were true. In the central hall Earth's ambassador stood with her helmet off and her face clear, and she watched without speaking. speaking, for there are moments when witness is more powerful than action. She approached Zalira and extended a hand, not as demand, not as deal, but as bond. The hand was taken and held, and something passed between them, not visible but real. The human walked the halls now, not as guest, not as warrior, not as symbol, but as thread, and every room he entered became warmer, and every face he met became less afraid. Children followed him, asking questions about Earth, about the sea, about the stars, and he answered everyone with patience and wonder, and his voice was soft, but carried far. He met with those who had once cursed his name and did not speak of hate, only of healing, and he listened longer than he spoke, and many who once stood against him now walked beside him in the prison beneath the old tower. The former general sat in silence, and when the human came to see him, no guard followed, and no weapon came near. You were never my enemy, the human said. You were only afraid, but fear without truth becomes poison, and you drank deeply. I forgive you, but I do not forget. You will remain until the people say otherwise, and I will visit again, not as judge, but as witness. The general did not speak, and the human turned and left, and the door closed without echo. Above the palace, the old observatory now burned bright with new lights, as scholars from Earth and Vel worked together to map not just stars but stories, and every line drawn became a bridge between minds. Once distant ships moved between the fleets, now not with shields but with gifts, and the black of space no longer felt so cold. In the gardens where once only nobles walked, now played children of every shape and every shade, and the flowers seemed brighter not because of sun but because of Galactic. Solera walked the garden path with bare feet, and the wind moved through her hair like song, and she breathed not as ruler, not as warrior, not as daughter of a throne, but as someone finally free. A human sat beneath the oldest tree and looked to the sky, and a voice beside him asked if he missed Earth. He smiled, not with sadness but with softness. Earth lives in me, and now so does this place. I was not born here, but I have bled here, and I have healed here, and I have loved here, and that is enough. That night no stars fell, and no ships roared, and no blades rose, only music from small instruments, and voices telling new stories in new words with old meaning. Stories of a human who split a champion not for glory but for life. Stories of a princess who gave up a throne to lift her people. Stories of maids who found their own names and used them with pride. And in every version of every tale, the end was not an end but a beginning, because the empire that once stood alone now stood with others, not above, not below, but beside, and that was more than victory, that was peace.